Adolf Anderssen's Immortal Game, played at the first international chess tournament in London, 1851, has been analyzed many times over the past century and a half, but it's always worth one more look. Anderssen has the white pieces and he's playing against Lionel Kieseritzky. Anderssen opens with e4, Kieseritzky plays e5, and Anderssen goes right into the king's gambit, a very aggressive opening, not entirely sound and not often seen at the highest level these days. Kieseritzky accepts the gambit, and Anderssen plays bishop to c4, which is again an aggressive line. Anderssen could have played his knight from g1 to f3 to prevent black's queen from coming into h4 to deliver an early check, but Anderssen decides to go with the more aggressive bishop to c4 and allow Kieseritzky right on move 3 to deliver a check, dislodging Anderssen's king. So king f1. Kieseritzky does have a strange follow-up to this, though. b5 doesn't really accomplish anything. He distracts Anderssen's bishop from the c4 square. Anderssen plays bishop takes b5, but there's no lasting gain for black. Black would have been better off developing a piece, as he does on this move, knight to f6. Anderssen plays knight to f3, chasing the black queen back to h6, and now plays d3, defending his e4 pawn and opening up his dark-squared bishop onto black's pawn on f4. Alright, now Kieseritzky plays knight to h5, and this is a violation of one of the opening principles that we know, which is not to move the same piece more than once unless there's a good reason for it. Now, Anderssen moved his bishop twice, once to c4 and once to b5, but there was a good reason for it as the bishop was under attack. Kieseritzky, however, is bringing his knight from g8 to f6 to h5 with the intention of landing it on the g3 square to fork white's king and rook. But this can be easily addressed for white if Anderssen were to just play his rook from h1 to g1, getting out of the fork. Notice that the h2 pawn is pinned, so it wouldn't be able to capture an intruder on g3. Anderssen, however, replies in form and moves his knight a second time, now blocking the h-file. We see that his knight is going to be landing on the f5 square, which is a very active square. Alright, so queen to g5 forks, temporarily at least, white's bishop on b5 and the knight on h4. Anderssen addresses both threats by playing his knight into f5, which is where we knew it was headed. Black plays c6. He attacks the bishop on b5, but he again neglects development. And this time, Anderssen doesn't bother moving the bishop again. He instead plays his pawn straight to g4, attacking black's oddly placed knight on h5. Notice that the g4 pawn cannot be captured en passant by black's pawn because of the pin from the bishop on c1. Kieseritzky retreats the knight back to f6, which is its only safe square, but notice that now the queen on g5 is running out of squares. Its retreat along the d8-h4 diagonal has now been blocked by the knight on f6. Anderssen plays rook to g1, adding extra support to the g4 pawn, and Kieseritzky snatches up the bishop on b5, so black is up a full piece. Pawn to h4 drives the queen back to g6, its only safe square, and then pawn to h5 grabs more space on the king side for white, and the black queen is forced to return to g5. Anderssen brings his queen up to f3 now, developing the queen, and now there's a double attack on the pawn on f5 from white's queen on f3 and bishop on c1. There's no adequate way to defend the pawn on f4, and more than that, if white gets a move in, bishop takes pawn, this queen on g5 is now trapped. So Kieseritzky does play the best move to hang on to his material. He plays his knight from f6 back to g8. It's a sad move, but he had to open up the queen's retreat along the d8-h4 diagonal. So Anderssen proceeds by capturing the pawn and driving the queen back to f6, the place where the knight just was. But look at black's pieces. They are almost all still on their starting squares. Black is up a bishop, but white has more than enough compensation for the piece. Anderssen brings his knight on b1 into the game, and Kieseritzky finally develops his kingside bishop with an attack on white's rook on g1. Anderssen brings the knight further into the center, this time with an attack on the queen on f6 and threatening a fork on c7. Black addresses the threat by moving the queen out of danger and creating a counter threat on white's second rook. Now both of white's rooks are under fire, but instead of moving either one, Anderssen plays bishop into d6, which is actually a mistake. Anderssen would have been better off bringing his queen rook to safety with rook to e1. And now black does not have time to take the rook on g1. If black were to continue with bishop takes g1, white would have knight to d6 check. King to d8 would be terrible. There's no good move for black here, but king to d8 would allow knight takes f7 check, opening up the f-file and driving the king back to e8. So after king to f8, white has this nice move, bishop back to its home square c1, opening up the queen's attack on f7, which would be checkmate, and also attacking black's queen on b2. Black cannot hold this together. So white playing rook to e1 in this position was objectively the best move, but Anderssen could not resist sacrificing both of his rooks, so he played his bishop into the d6 square. Alright, Kieseritzky plays bishop takes rook, but this is a misstep as well. Queen takes rook on a1 was better. This would drive the king to e2, and then the queen would return to its post on b2. Black has snatched up an entire rook, and although his bishop on c5 is hanging, if white then plays bishop takes c5, black wins the piece back immediately with queen takes c2 check, forking the king and bishop. The position will still be scary for black as he's badly underdeveloped and white has aggressively placed knights, but black should be able to hold this. So after bishop to d6, we have bishop takes g1, and white plays e5. And this is it's a pretty amazing move to have sacrificed a bishop early on, sacrificed your king rook, leaving your queen rook hanging, which will be captured with check, and for all of this, playing a pawn move in the center. But this move is critical as it blocks the queen's defense of the g7 pawn. So we'll see how this plays in to Anderssen's victory. Queen takes rook, picks up the second rook, and drives white's king to e2. But now white has an immediate threat of checkmate. If it were white to play, he would simply play knight takes g7 check, forcing the black king to d8, and then bishop to c7 is checkmate. Kieseritzky addresses this threat by playing knight to a6. This covers the c7 square, so he can capture the bishop when it lands there. But Anderssen had this in mind, and he goes at the king from the other direction, starting, of course, with knight takes g7 check, king to d8, and now for the final sacrifice. I'll give you a few seconds to pause the video if you haven't seen this problem yet. White's next move, queen to f6, sacrifices the queen. It forces the knight on g8 to take on f6, but in doing so, he loses defense of the e7 square, and the bishop drops in from the center. Bishop to e7 is checkmate. The game is over. Pretty incredible how white was able to sacrifice his bishop in the opening, followed by both of his rooks in the middle game, and then his queen for a mate in 2. Black is up a ton of material here, but his pieces are almost entirely on the edges of the board. Both rooks, his queen, his bishop, both bishops actually, one of his 2 knights. White's 3 surviving pieces are doing more than black's entire army. And this is the Immortal Game.